The European Union has agreed to a 25% tariff on all Mercedes-Benz and BMW vehicles entering the U.S. market, marking a significant challenge for German automotive manufacturers. At the same time, Germany's automotive industry faces rising factory closures, mass layoffs, and increasing global competition. These developments are shaking the country's industrial strength. There are also growing concerns about the long-term viability of the Chinese automotive market, especially in the premium segment, which is now attracting more attention from automakers. For decades, German luxury brands like Mercedes, BMW, and Audi have been firmly established in the U.S. market, synonymous with high-end quality. However, the Trump administration's imposition of harsh tariffs has caused a major shift. President Donald Trump made it clear that any company that does not produce vehicles in the U.S. would face tariffs as high as 25% on imported vehicles. The cost of production skyrocketed for companies like BMW, Mercedes, and Audi, which had already invested heavily in U.S. manufacturing. The European Union has agreed to impose a 25% tariff on all Mercedes-Benz and BMW vehicles, putting the German automakers under intense pressure. The tariffs also apply to components like engines, electronics, and digital instrument panels, adding significantly to production costs. For these companies, the choice was simple: either raise prices substantially or absorb massive losses per vehicle sold. Neither option was viable in the long term, pushing them to reconsider their U.S. operations. The BMW Spartanburg plant in South Carolina, a hub for producing 270,000 SUVs annually, and Mercedes-Benz's Tuscaloosa, Alabama plant, which assembles popular models like the GLE and GLS, faced critical challenges. Audi, although it doesn't have U.S. production facilities, was seeing growth with its imported vehicles. However, the new tariffs on critical components, including engines and control units, raised production costs to unsustainable levels. Passing these costs on to consumers would lead to a drastic reduction in sales, while absorbing them would result in massive losses. The only remaining choice was to scale back operations and eventually pull out of the U.S. market. The decision was a shock to dealers who learned the news through social media. German luxury vehicles were left idling in showrooms, and customers were left wondering about warranties, parts, and servicing. The disruption was felt across the entire automotive ecosystem. Dealers, financial institutions, logistics companies, and advertising agencies that supported the German automotive industry also faced significant losses. Despite the strain on the industry, the Trump administration remained firm, stating that its goal was to protect U.S. interests. "The factory will either stay here or it won't exist at all," the administration said. Looking at the market impact, by the end of 2024, German automakers had sold approximately 950,000 vehicles in the U.S., generating between $55 billion and $60 billion in revenue, or around 6% of the total U.S. automotive market. The loss of such a significant market share was catastrophic. BMW's Spartanburg plant alone was expected to generate around $14 billion in 2024 revenue from 270,000 X-Series SUVs, with 70% of that staying in the domestic market. Mercedes-Benz's Alabama operations generated around $13 billion in sales. For Audi, which had been importing its vehicles into the U.S., the tariffs also disrupted its sales model. Audi's vehicles accounted for $15 billion in revenue in 2024. With production costs surging due to tariffs on imported components, these models became unsustainable. For BMW, Mercedes, and Audi, companies that had made significant investments in U.S. manufacturing, this was a painful reversal. Meanwhile, a global shift was occurring. China welcomed German automakers with open arms. Mercedes, BMW, and Audi began expanding their operations in China, with design studios in Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. Mercedes announced it would develop its new electric vehicle, EV platform in China. Instead of the US, BMW decided to shift its production to Chengdu, leaving behind its US ambitions. Audi also saw China as a more favorable market, with fewer political risks and growing potential. This shift to China is a double blow to the US market. Not only has it lost German brands, but it has also strengthened Germany's position in Asia. With German automakers no longer heavily reliant on the US market, the question remains, who will fill the void? US automakers like Ford and GM were expected to benefit from the German brand's retreat, However, the supply chain remains chaotic. The exit of these companies disrupted the U.S. automotive ecosystem, particularly by halting the importation of many key components from Europe. The result is higher production costs, which will ultimately drive up prices for consumers. Economists have argued that Trump's tariffs were designed to protect domestic industries, but the long-term effects have been disruptive. Many believe that while the U.S. will eventually build a self-sufficient supply chain, the transition will be painful. Meanwhile, platforms reliant on the automotive sector are revisiting their strategies due to the uncertainty in the market. Was this policy really necessary? Some argue that the U.S. had been overly dependent on foreign automakers for too long. Others counter that brands like Mercedes-Benz and BMW have been manufacturing in the U.S. for decades, providing thousands of jobs. The closure of these plants has led to job losses and significant economic disruption. Looking ahead, the ultimate outcome of this trade battle remains uncertain. German automakers may focus on expanding in Asia, but they may also return to the U.S. market if conditions improve. Meanwhile, the U.S. is trying to create its own autonomous vehicle ecosystem, though the short-term outlook appears bleak. From a macroeconomic perspective, analysts predict a direct decline of $45 billion in automotive trade volume for the U.S. over the next few years. With the value of U.S. automotive imports standing at $350 billion in 2024, this loss represents a substantial hit to the economy. Furthermore, U.S. automotive exports are expected to decrease by $15 billion, primarily due to the loss of German production plants and export channels for vehicles like the BMW X5 and Mercedes-Benz GLC, which were sold globally as made. The departure of German automakers from the U.S. market may have reduced the country's dependency on imports, but it also eliminated crucial export revenues. Additionally, around 2,500 companies in the U.S. automotive supply chain have either downsized or shut down due to the loss of business from German OEMs. Without the German market, these suppliers face significant uncertainty. Local suppliers are exploring alternatives, such as relocating to Mexico or Canada, but many are struggling to find new opportunities. Economists estimate that the U.S. automotive supply chain could lose up to $4 billion in business volume. The situation serves as a stark reminder of how vulnerable even the most powerful economies can be to rapid shifts in global trade and policy. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget like and subscribe for the latest updates on global politics.